Hi, today I'm going to tell you about the Canterbury Tales of Geoffrey Chaucer. I think it's the greatest poem in English. In fact, I know it is. There is nothing greater. Certainly not Paradise Lost or the Prelude of Wordsworth, nothing. And one of the great poems of the world. Chaucer lived roughly from 1340 to 1400. He wrote in what is called Middle English. I'll give you a sketch of the English language quickly. Let's begin with the Celts. The Celtic peoples invaded the British Isles sometime around 500 BCE. They were not united politically. They were united, if at all, religiously. The next to arrive were the Romans. And the Romans took over most of England, except for Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall, southwest England, jutting out. And the Celts remained there. The Romans, of course, did the Roman thing. They built cities, they built roads, they built to last, they had laws. They were the great civilization of the world at that time. But by 410 CE, Christian era, the empire was beginning to collapse, and Rome itself, the city, was in great danger from the Visigoths, barbarians who were conquest-minded. So the emperor recalled the troops, the legions of the Roman legions from England, to Rome to defend Rome. And they didn't defend very successfully, actually. Anyway, that meant that the Romans, for practical purposes, were gone. This left England open to invasion. And the Angles and Saxons and Jutes from North Germany, Denmark, and South Sweden invaded, respectively, South, Central, and Northern England, beginning, we usually say, around 449. Now, this is really the beginning of the English language. What language did these people speak? They spoke Old German. Old German changes gradually a little bit, and it is called by us Anglo-Saxon, combining two of those three Germanic tribes. Anglo-Saxon, then, is the oldest version of England, but Anglo-Saxon really is German. Old German. It is modified a little gradually. The English language really begins in 1066 when William, Duke of Normandy, with his French-Norman army, invaded England because William claimed the throne of England. 1066. So really the English language begins in 1066. That means really the English language is one of the least old, I don't want to say the youngest, but one of the least old languages in the world. It is a blend directly of the Anglo-Saxon, which was German, and French. The Normans took over, and the Normans became the ruling class, so that all laws, all culture was French. But gradually, the ruling Normans and the underling Anglo-Saxons had to communicate, and so both languages changed, and the result was what we call, gradually, Middle English. Middle English usually dates between 1066 and 1500. And, of course, there's Chaucer right in the middle of that. Chaucer lived at so it was during Chaucer's lifetime that the English language officially became the language of England. That happened because it officially became the language of Parliament. Chaucer served in Parliament for a while. Anyway, now I'll tell you a little about Chaucer, but I don't want to spend too long on the background. I want to tell you as much as I can about the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer was born, I would call it, in the upper middle class. He had advantages, and so he served as a page boy in aristocratic homes. And he became attached especially to John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was the brother of the king, one of the brothers of the King of England. He was a huge landowner, the richest man in England. And he is also associated with John Wycliffe, and possibly some connection with the Lollard movement. The Lollards were basically precursors, early Protestants. I can't talk much about their doctrine, but John Wycliffe is the first man to translate the Bible, or most of the Bible, into English. And this around 1380. How did he get away with this? He got away with this because he was protected by John of Gaunt. And John of Gaunt's power was immense, even though he wasn't the king. Chaucer, too, is connected with John of Gaunt. So he had advantages, a good education, and then he actually served Edward III as a diplomat to Italy. He spent about 2 years in Italy as a young man, and that's where he came in contact with Dante, with the Divine Comedy. He may have met Petrarch and Boccaccio because they were still alive, probably by that time. Petrarch for sure. In any case, it's clear that he absorbed the Divine Comedy, and that is very important. I mean, the most important European poem of the last 1,000 years. It's possible, though, that Canterbury Tales is second. That's an interesting thought. Anyway, he absorbed all he could of Italian Renaissance culture, or proto-Renaissance, as we called it before. That is, that early glow during the 14th century. Dante died in 1321. Giotto died in 1337. Boccaccio died in about 1360, and so I guess he couldn't have known him. And Petrarch 1374. So that great period of early Italian Renaissance thinking and agitation, Chaucer came in direct contact with. Wow. So, humanistic learning, the father of the Renaissance. I didn't mention Petrarch when I talked about the Renaissance. I should have, because most people would call him an early hero of the Renaissance. He was a humanist, that is, a scholar. He loved learning, and he is certainly a strong forerunner to the Renaissance in every sense of the word. Excuse me. Okay, back to Chaucer. Chaucer is famous mainly for two long poems. One of them is Troilus and Cressida. I won't talk about that, but it's such a different poem from the Canterbury Tales that it's remarkable. It has almost no humor at all. It's a love story of love gone bad, basically, and that's all I'll say about it. Its form, too, is regular. It's written in a 7-line stanza, quite different from Canterbury Tales. Okay, to the Canterbury Tales, then. This remarkable poem, which is about the same length as, say, the Iliad and Odyssey, 15,000 lines. I'm not sure how many, but 15,000 maybe. Okay. The situation is this. The main character is called Chaucer Pilgrim. Now, this is a wonderful refinement which Chaucer picked up directly from Dante, because in the Divine Comedy, Dante Pilgrim, travels through the three realms, hell, purgatory, and paradise. This person is Dante Pilgrim, though. He's not Dante author. There is clearly, obviously, a difference between the two. and Dante author, treats Dante Pilgrim, especially in the early stages, with a great deal of irony. After all, he's kind of foolish. Dante Pilgrim is often foolish. Says and does very foolish things, especially at the beginning. Well, this is the idea that this is the source of Chaucer's great idea, which Chaucer does much more with, really, than Dante did. Chaucer Pilgrim, who is this guy? Well, first of all, the opening of the work. The work is divided between the general prologue, which is only about 800 lines long, and the rest of the poem, which consists of the tales. Now, Chaucer Pilgrim announces that it was spring, April, when the earth is thawing and the birds and bees awaken and the flowers, and people feel vitality, implied sexual vitality too, and are restless. They have energy. They're so happy that the winter is over. And sometimes they turn their energies toward going on pilgrimages. The most famous shrine in Old England for pilgrims to travel to was Canterbury. Canterbury in southeast England, Kent County. Canterbury had been the place where Thomas à Becket, St. Thomas, had been martyred. I'll tell you his story briefly, even though it doesn't fit directly, but it's an important story. Okay, Thomas à Becket was a Saxon, but he rose to a position of high power under Henry II, who was a Norman king. And he was a pretty great king, actually. He was the father of Richard the Lionhearted and King John. Okay, so Henry was a cunning man, the king, Henry II. He didn't trust his Normans, but he picked out and he became the protector of, and apparently they became good friends, he and Thomas à Becket. Becket was a very sharp, very intelligent man. If you want to see a great, great movie, I don't know a better one, see Becket with Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole. There is no better movie as far as I'm concerned. It was the adaptation from a play, which was pretty great too, I guess. Okay, what happens? So, Henry always needs money. He's got wars all the time. Kings always needed money. And when they ran out of money, sources of money from their aristocrats and the middle class, they tried to turn to the church. But the church had always been immune from taxation, and so if a king got any money from the church, it was a gift. So Henry turned to the church, but the church was not in the giving mood. So at that time, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was and is the most powerful person in the medieval Church of England, that is Catholic, or the modern Church of England, Anglican, the Archbishop died, and Henry, the king, who could appoint people to this position, suddenly realized, wait, I think I'll appoint my friend Thomas à Becket. Oh, what a good idea. He just qualified, he had minimal qualifications, and he did it. He made Becket his Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Becket had been a fun-loving, somewhat mischievous person, but in the film, and it's tempting to believe the film, there must have been a vast thirst, a vast emptiness in this man Becket during his secular days before. Because what happens to him when he becomes archbishop is he becomes a saint. He gives away, he sells all the gold plate, all the gold and trappings of the church for money, and gives food to the poor. He washes the feet of the poor, Christ-like. And in the movie, in the film anyway, he does this with total sincerity. There is no play acting here. He becomes a man of God. He becomes a saint in the full sense of the word. But in doing so, he is betraying Henry, because Henry had counted on having Becket be his right-hand man, his inside man in the church. But suddenly, Becket became a saint whose whole purpose in life was to serve God and serve the church. Well, collision. In the end, cutting through here, according to tradition, one night, drunk probably, Henry turned to four of his barons there, these burly WWF kind of guys, and said, "Will no one rid me of this meddling priest?" Well, of course he didn't say that, but that's the tradition. The four muscles look at each other, get on their horses, they're in London, and ride all night to Canterbury. Early in the morning, Becket is saying Mass, as he did every morning. The four henchmen enter the church, kill him at the altar, kill him on the steps leading to the east end. Terrible. Well, he was, of course, loved by the people. And this created a huge problem for Henry. So Henry, of course, condemned the four men to death, who had only done what he had pretty much requested, and then did penance himself, and built the great church, the great cathedral, still great cathedral, at Canterbury, which was sacred to St. Thomas, because Becket was canonized as a saint very soon. Minimum time, I'm sure, maybe less. And so this church became the great shrine and object of pilgrims who wanted to make a pilgrimage to a holy place, to pray for God's blessings, God's forgiveness, whatever. Back to our story. It's April. People feel restless in London, in and around London. They go on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. Okay, one night Chaucer Pilgrim had stayed at an inn in South London, Southwark, and there he ran into a group of 29 pilgrims who were all going to Canterbury. He asked if he might join them. They said sure, and that made 30. At dinner, the host, the owner of the inn, was attracted to the idea, and he suggested that he, the host, join them also, and he even suggested some entertainment. They would travel together for safety, thieves, all that, but he suggested that they take turns telling stories. Each pilgrim would tell 2 stories on the journey to Canterbury. Each pilgrim would tell 2 on the way back. The person who told the best story would then earn a free dinner at the expense of the others, and they would all enjoy themselves finally when they returned. Everyone liked this idea. The host joined them, making total 31. Okay, now in theory, if 31 people are telling 2 stories on the way and 2 back, 31 times 4 is about 124. 31, 62, 124. 124 stories? That's impossible. In the end, there are only 29 stories. And so people used to think, well, Chaucer's poem is incomplete. I think his poem is complete. And I'll try to explain why later. But now you see, this means that every story we are hearing through Chaucer Pilgrim. Chaucer Pilgrim is the Canterbury Tales. Who then is this Chaucer Pilgrim? Well, in the first place, all of the pilgrims are middle class. Middle class. From somewhat lower middle class to upper middle class. And that includes Chaucer Pilgrim too. That's very important. Chaucer is offering us a cross-section of the middle classes of England around 1386. Fascinating. Now, I want to say who Chaucer Pilgrim is. I want to tell you about him, but then I have something very important to tell you as background, which I think I've talked about in other lectures, and that is the bubonic plague, the Black Plague. First, Chaucer Pilgrim. It's clear that Chaucer Pilgrim is somewhat naive, that he loves and respects power, wealth, position. Like most of us, alas, like all of us, most of the time anyway, most of us all the time, we are awed by power, wealth, and position. We should be ashamed of ourselves, but it's a rare human being who can overcome this stupidity. Chaucer Pilgrim certainly does not overcome it. He respects anyone who has power, wealth, or position, automatically has Chaucer's respect, if not veneration. And alas, most of us are like that too. Okay, fools that we are. Now, Black Plague, the Black Death. It had broken out, I'm not going to retell that story, but the years were 1347 to 49 or 50. During those 3 years, it began in Italy and spread north, and it wiped out, it killed 1/3 of the population of Europe. This had an especially huge effect on the church. And it's a little theory of mine, I'm sure historians have said it, God, 1,000 times. Maybe they've unsaid it. But it seems to me that, okay, where the plague spread was especially where people lived in close contact. One of these places would be monasteries. The monasteries that were scattered around England, and many of them were wealthy and powerful. But that's not the point. At such places, the population, like in cities, countryside too though, was decimated. A lot of death. Now, if it's true, and I raise the question, if it's true that the people who felt the religious vocation during the, especially the 12th and 13th centuries, the high points of the church, if it's true that those people were motivated by high idealism, by a high level of piety, and certainly the best of them were, I kind of question, though, parenthetically, because of Chaucer, really, this theory seems to me a bit naive. After all, what we want to assume is that at one time people were filled with religious passion. They aren't now. But underlying this theory is the belief that people kind of change, that some periods of time are much nobler, people are just plain better morally, more exalted, in intellect, morally, ethically, and I wonder, is that true? I doubt it. I doubt it. I doubt that there was ever this age of faith that we are led to believe. Now, anyone who studies medieval art especially, as I have, knows story after story about the entire population of Chartres dragging and pulling stones to build that miracle, the Cathedral of Chartres, Chartres. And so we try to form this sentimental picture of, oh my God, all those people motivated by love of God, all of these people filled with faith and devotion as we are not. I can't believe it. When I think about it, I don't believe it. That ever people were like that in great numbers, I doubt. People are people. And let's face it, we cannot reach very great heights, not very often, not many of us, some of us never, and that's just the way we are. You see my point. This view of history is a very romantic one, and I think it's another case of self-deception. We want to believe that out of some romantic nostalgia. It's foolery, I fear. Okay, to my point. But assuming that the people who lived in monasteries in 1340 were of a higher caliber, that is idealistic, really devoted to God and to church and to goodness and to caritas and love and all that, that generation was wiped out by the plague. And the people who filled those empty slots after the plague were clearly not of the same, not cut from the same cloth, as we say, that clumsy metaphor, not the same kind of people. Chaucer is at least saying this, because the picture we get of humanity in Canterbury Tales is not pretty. It is not pretty. Is it exaggerated? I don't believe it. I think every one of those people still can be found. Just look around. Chaucer is a genius at depicting realistically human beings. And I'll try to show you this. But as a side, the main portraits that have the greatest value, in my opinion, in the Canterbury Tales are those of ecclesiastics, of church people. And the portraits are striking. I think I'll tell you about them and then tell you about some of the others. We meet everybody, or almost everybody, in the general prologue. So I'll tell you about the general prologue, and then I'll tell you tales, the ones I can remember, and that will be entertainment. But this is greatness. He's my hero. Chaucer is my hero. I mean, Shakespeare, okay, but Chaucer is my hero. Here we go, the general prologue. He tells about the meeting at the inn, and then at the end of the prologue, the host joins them. Okay, but meanwhile, he, Chaucer Pilgrim, describes the pilgrims. First, he begins, of course, with the knight. Why the knight? Because the knight was the highest ranking one. And Chaucer Pilgrim is very awed by his position. Now remember, a knight was not an aristocrat. A knight became a knight, but his position was not, would not be passed on. He wasn't a land-owning aristocrat. He was just a knight. So, strictly speaking, the knight belongs to the middle class. Chaucer Pilgrim's description of the knight is, of course, he was wonderful. And he had fought battles here, and he was wonderful. And he had fought battles here, and he was wonderful. He was a gentle, perfect knight, Chaucer says. But the historians have discovered, and the 20th century, to its glory, I mean, as an aside, the most glorious thing of the 20th century, the age of information, was not its literature, because I don't think there was, I think when all the air clears, there was no great literature in the 20th century, I suspect. Not much. Few novels, but to put those novels in the same breath as, to utter them in the same breath as Canterbury Tales, nonsense. And that includes 1984, Lord of the Flies, or any other work. I mean, it just doesn't compare. It's gone already. And I think probably the 21st century will be the same. I would like to make an exception, but I doubt it. Chaucer is a giant. Okay, back to our story. The reason why I mentioned the 20th century is because it was a golden age of scholarship. The golden age of scholarship was the 20th century. The things that the 20th century scholars found, from archaeological findings to historical findings, well, they discovered civilizations that had been forgotten. I include the 19th century in this, late 19th century, but it was a golden age of scholarship, of learning, of discovery. And these discoveries included discoveries of Shakespeare. It's like previous generations really didn't understand him. That's a dangerous statement. And Chaucer. The scholars have gone to work and found that these battles in which the knight participated were not very glorious things. In fact, they were kind of shameful things. And what we realize about the knight is that, yes, the knight was a great knight, a great fighter, but he was a mercenary. He fought for money. And if the Muslims could pay him more than the Christians paid him, he fought for the Muslims against the Christians. Well, Chaucer Pilgrim, of course, prefers not to think about that. So always there are these two levels. There's Chaucer Pilgrim's perception of things, which is always naive and silly, and there is Chaucer author's irony at work, which is biting, which is profound, which is great. Okay, after the knight there follows the squire, his son, and yeoman, who was kind of his follower. But the squire was kind of a pretty boy, a lover. It's hard, I think, as far as I know, the scholars don't know what Chaucer's telling us there. The yeoman is kind of a henchman. That is, don't mess with him, he was one tough guy. By the way, almost everybody is armed. This is a time of violence. I mean, police? No. The world, let's face it, there have only been policemen for the last 200 years. Until that time, people were punished for crimes if they were strong enough to punish the perpetrator of the crimes. Okay, these were tough characters, tough middle-class citizens. Middle class means they fought and struggled, they're good at what they do, and they have some money. Okay. Then we get a series of church figures after the knight, the squire, and the yeoman. The first we get is a prioress. She's called the nun or the prioress. A prioress was the head of a convent for women, of course, and the head of a convent, like the head of a monastery, had absolute power over those people in that community. That person was the law, and that's even part of the monastic system. There was no law that transcended the law, the authority of the prioress or abbot in an abbey. And we have to remember this. Now, of course, Chaucer is very impressed by her. She wears nice clothes. Should she? I don't think so. She has a little pet puppy dog to whom she feeds milk and special meats and fine foods and all that. But we wonder, does she treat the poor who live near her priory, the convent? Does she treat them to such fine foods? I don't think so. If there are 30 lines about her, 20 of those lines have to do with food. And now, she's very careful about her French accent. In short, she's very concerned about appearing to be refined, elegant. She wants to be courtly. She wants to be an aristocrat. And so she's worked on her French, but we realize her French accent is the wrong accent. It's not the Parisian French, it's some provincial English French. And she doesn't understand that. Then when she eats in this dainty manner. And Chaucer spends 8 lines describing how she eats. She dips her food gently in some sauce, blah, 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 blah. And she, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, gradually we realize, if we look closely, that the woman is obese, that she's obsessed with eating. Should she be obese? As a nun, I don't think so. Should she wear fine fur inside her cloth? I don't think so. Should she be wearing that pin, that pendant around her neck that says, or a brooch, I guess, a pin, that is made in the form of the letter A. And under that A is the Latin amor vincit omnia. Amor vincit or vincit omnia. Love conquers all things. Well, this amor, I don't think this is agape. I don't think this is agape. This woman is a sensualist. And that amor can only refer to sexual love. With whom? She's only surrounded by women over whom she has absolute authority, absolute power. Sorry, but she's a lesbian and a tyrant. She has absolute power. She lives only for her sensual pleasures. Now, Chaucer Pilgrim tells us she's very sentimental about animals, and she would weep tears if she saw a little mouse wounded or hurt or dying. But these tears that she weeps, does she feel them? Does she shed them for human beings who are poor or sick or suffering? I don't think so. Later she will tell a story that viewed in the light of this, because we have to always compare the portrait of the character in the general prologue with the tale that he or she tells later. She tells a story, I'm going to go out of order here to explain. She tells a story about the murder of a little boy, which takes place in the ghetto section of some town. Ghetto where the Jews were confined. Naturally, everyone assumes that some Jew did it. And they torture and kill some Jews. And she, the prioress, enjoys this. She thinks this is great. This is justice. What's Chaucer saying? In the first place, the woman is a monster. And these sentimental tears that she weeps for a mouse, she has no such tears for other human beings because they're Jews. What? Chaucer obviously is a man of tolerance, of gentleness, of greatness of heart. And he certainly had nothing against Jews, I would guess. And this makes me think about, I'm interested in the religious views of great authors. I'm interested in Chaucer's religion. I'm interested in Homer's religion. And I think these are the essential questions. Chaucer's religion. I think Chaucer was a latitudinarian, that is, broadly a Christian, but he went beyond Christianity, I want to believe. This is just Cook talking, perhaps. But that story, that little glimpse that we get from the prioress's tale, tells me a lot. Anyway, that's the kind of thing one must find in Chaucer, and there it is. It's just waiting to be found. And the person who doesn't find it is the kind of simpleton that Chaucer Pilgrim is. So Chaucer Pilgrim is a huge trap waiting for us. And if we fall into the trap, we're fools. And it's easy to fall into the traps. And the scholars, God bless them, have brought to life all these ironies and the brilliance of Chaucer. It was understood before the 20th century, the 19th century, but not to the same degree, I'm pretty sure, that it can be understood now. What a genius. Okay, after the prioress, we get the monk. Oh, by the way, at the end of the prioress, Chaucer Pilgrim tells us that she was traveling with one nun and two priests, but he doesn't describe them at all. And that is key. Remember that. The two priests. One of the priests later tells the greatest of all the stories. He's the greatest of all the human beings in Canterbury Tales. He's called the nun's priest. That is, he's one of those anonymous priests riding along with the nun. But Chaucer Pilgrim didn't even deign stoop to describe him. Why? Because he's poor. He's not middle class. He then later tells the greatest of all the stories. And Chaucer Pilgrim even must admit that it's pretty great. But he doesn't really respect him. Chaucer, the author's man in the Canterbury Tales, his man, his hero, is the nun's priest. I'll tell this story later. This, after describing the nun and mentioning the three riding with her, he describes the monk. Now the monk is an abbot. He was the head of an abbey. That is, and this abbey was big, lots of money. And the monk is described as loving, his passion is hunting. Well, to hunt, one must have horses, and one must have dogs, and they're expensive. A horse is a Mercedes. The monk has a stable full of horses. Those hunting dogs, the best dogs, are all equises. So he's got a stable of Mercedes-Benzes and equises. Huge money. It's his passion. And Chaucer Pilgrim says the monk didn't care about the old Benedictine rule, St. Benedict's rule, which guided, or was supposed to guide all monks. That's old-fashioned. He likes the modern way, which is basically do whatever you want. And Chaucer Pilgrim agrees with him. What a fool. What an ass. So, now, more about the monk. Very interesting man. He's got a totally bald head that glistens. Clearly, I think he oils that head. Now, physiognomy. Physiognomy, it means face, and a physiognomist is a person who studies human faces to try to figure out what kind of person that is. Big nose, this. Big forehead, this. Blue eyes, this. Gray eyes, this. Thick lips, and so forth. And Chaucer is a master of this, but the people of his time were very interested in this too. That bald head of that monk, and he too is wearing a pin tied in a lover's knot. Why is Chaucer telling us this? I think he is the same as the nun, as the prioress. That is, that glistening bald head and that lover's knot tell us that he is sexually active. With whom? Well, there are nobody but men in that abbey. He's a homosexual. He's gay. He's another sensualist. He lives for pleasure, the pleasures of the hunt. He wears elegant clothes, expensive. He's a sensualist, just like the nun. Look at this picture that Chaucer's presenting here. Then follows a third one, the friar. A friar was a Franciscan monk. The Franciscans were an order of mendicants. That is, a person who followed Francis had as his ideal poverty, embraced a life of poverty, and even begged for food or anything he could get. But these Franciscans, these friars, had their own territory. And Chaucer Pilgrim says, if any other friar tried to invade our friar's territory, look out, because this man was tough. He was strong and tough, and he liked to fight, maybe. But above all, he likes lovemaking. And this particular friar had priestly powers. That is, he could absolve a sinner. He could offer absolution and penance to a sinner. And he did this. Now, how did he have this power? Could he prove that he had that power? That he was a priest? No. Did he have to? No. And he especially likes to absolve bar girls and rich city women. He's another sensualist. Except he at least is heterosexual. He loves his pleasures. Does he like to spend time among lepers, the poor, the outcast, the starving, the suffering? No. Psh, he didn't care a thing about them. He likes to spend time in the bars, and he likes money. And he could always get money even out of a poor widow. Well, the poor widow reminds us of the widow's mite, the story in the New Testament that Christ tells, a parable. And the point is that the poor widow, Christ says, by giving even a little bit, she gave all she had. And her gift was worth much more than the rich man's large gift. Okay, but this friar could get a farthing, a little coin, even out of a poor widow. So he's an antichrist. He's the opposite of what he should be. Not just unlike, he's the opposite. 1, 2, 3. These three powerful, rich church figures that follow 1, 2, 3 right after the knight, the squire, and the yeoman. Later on, we meet the nun's priest, and he, I would say, is probably a saint. He's a man of such wit, such charm, such intellect, such wisdom. He may not be a saint, but he's a sage. And he tells this wonderful story, the most famous of all the stories. I want to tell you about him, but I also have to tell you about the pardoner and the summoner. All in all, we get 9 of the pilgrims who are church people. 9 of them. 6 of them are monsters. 1 of them is the great man, the nun's priest. And 2 of them are saints. I better tell you about them. They come at the very end. They are the parson and the plowman. They're brothers. The poor parson serves in a country parish, and he covers a large distance. And if he hears that someone is sick, one of his poor parishioners, he will ride all night to try to help the person. If people don't have money to pay their tithe, 1/10 of their income that they're supposed to pay to the church, that's the income of the clergyman, he didn't care. It was okay. He's a saint. And when he tells his story, this is the parson now. His is the only one in prose. He tells his story in prose, and his story is no story. It's a sermon. He delivers a long, long sermon that is by far the longest story in the Canterbury Tales. But the trouble is, the parson is totally unbelievable. He is a total abstraction. He's a better human being than Christ. Is that believable? I don't think so. He's an abstraction, and Chaucer is making fun. His brother, the plowman, is the perfect human being outside the church. A perfect church member. He's a saint, absolute saint. Is he believable? No. So what do we have in this collection of 9 clerics, let's say, or I guess the plowman, strictly speaking, isn't, but I'm counting him. I'll count him. Maybe I'll stick with, 8. 6 of them are monsters. 1, 2, 3. No, 3 of them are monsters. 1 of them is unknown. 2 of them are unknown. The nun, the minor nun, and the minor priest whom we never see. That makes the 29, by the way. 31 minus 2. Guess we don't get a story from the host either? I'm not sure. 29 or 28. Anyway, the prioress, the monk, and the friar are moral monsters. The minor nun and the minor priest we never hear anything about. That's 5. Then we get the pardoner, who's a moral monster. The summoner, who is a moral monster. That makes 5 of them whom we know well are monsters. 2 of them are unknown because we never hear anything about them. Then we get the nun's priest, who is a great, great man. The great man. Chaucer's hero, anyone's hero. And then we get the parson, who is an abstraction, totally unbelievable. So I dismiss him completely. You see what my point is. My real point is that Chaucer has a very serious message, among others, directed at the church, directed at man's, in his time, but I think in all times, religious life. The super saint, unrealizable, unrecognizable as a human being. The more normal, monsters. The one man who is a great man, the nun's priest, doesn't even have a name. He's riding a shabby horse, too. Briefly, his story is a beast fable, as it's called. The main characters are mostly animals. The main character is a rooster, Chanticleer. He has his hens, who are his concubines, but he loves one of them. Her name is Pertelote. He loves her, and she loves him, and they have a great husband-wife relationship. Now, this is very important to me, because as far as I know, in the Canterbury Tales, the only instance of a love relationship, especially of a marriage, the only successful marriage is that between a rooster and a hen. The human beings, impossible. Is Chaucer saying this? I believe he is. Yes. I think it's pretty obvious. It's indisputable. Wow. Wow. What a man. The story goes, I hope I'll tell this. Chanticleer, the rooster, wakes up, lives on a farm. A widow owns the small farm. She's pretty poor. She has 2 daughters, and other than that, we get lots of animals. We're interested in the rooster and the hen. The rooster, Chanticleer, wakes up early one morning before dawn, and he had a bad dream. And he's shaking and trembling and making sounds. And his wife, Pertelote, says, "What's wrong? Are you a coward? Dreams are nothing. Dreams are nonsense. Dreams make no sense at all." And then Chanticleer says, "I'm sorry, dear, you're wrong." And he tells about all the great men in antiquity, Roman and Greek, but especially Roman, who all said that dreams are important, that dreams are indications, signs, even warnings of things to come. Chaucer's showing off all his learning here. Chaucer, by the way, was a vastly